Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'll do, a little brief intro and we'll kind of jump into this talk. So we'll spend the next 30 minutes or so kind of focused on why design systems have varying degrees of success, based on the people and the teams doing all that hard work, regardless of the tools that we're leveraging. So we're not really going to talk about the tooling today, but more about the process and kind of the high level thinking of a design system. So the content, again, focuses on the people and the practices, not so much the product. The goal really is just to bring you closer to your peers and build that confidence and a collaborative approach that you can apply basically starting tomorrow. So let me just move your faces out of the way here. So hey, I'm Jay. I spent the last 2 years as a customer success manager at InVision. I partner with some of our largest customers based here in Toronto, Canada. Not too sure how familiar you are with InVision, but we're totally remote. So pre-COVID, we are already distributed across the globe. Most of us are in the US, definitely a big group in Toronto, Canada here, and then we're kind of all across the globe as well, spread out into London and Amsterdam and Australia. But I have the privilege to spend time with organizations, discussing a lot of their challenges. A lot of the times it's related to sort of global cross-functional collaboration, a lot of times creating more efficient practices and workflows. It often includes some of the challenges that teams face when standing up a design system. So hence the topic today. So yeah, as mentioned earlier, if you don't mind kind of saving some of those comments until after, it'll take about 30 minutes and we can kind of have a discussion at the end. So let's get started. All right, so design systems are for people, not process. Today, we're going to focus on the things that you can't necessarily see. We're well into that fundamental transition of really what it means to design. It's changing the way that we approach our role in product development and really how we work with our peers. We've moved from that one viewport, that linear world where we had control over each screen and experience and interactions, to more logical solutions that are driven by integrations that really connect across numerous platforms. And they're expected to appear basically on any device. The market is conditioned to expect access to dynamic information that's presented seamlessly across all their devices. And they don't really concern themselves how hard that is to accomplish. From the field, I've been hearing a lot of the same challenges. The problems that we face today are increasingly becoming more complex to navigate. It's harder to anticipate edge cases and those desired paths, and we really have to account for many more inputs. On top of that, we have to design and provide for multiple screen types and user experiences. One product flow can really impact 4 or 5 or more users. If we think about an example like Uber Eats, you have to think about the user ordering, the restaurant receiving the order, the driver or that delivery person. There's really one outcome, but there's just really so many things to consider. Whether you're building consumer apps or you're in the enterprise, there's pressure to deliver these changes and that new functionality faster and faster. People don't inherently want to wait when there's a competitor waiting in the wings. People are just impatient. If your product isn't delivered to the market, it's really easy for that user to switch. We're dealing with more stakeholders across every corner of our organizations. People are paying more attention to design now. It's become more cross-functional, which is good. But it's created an opportunity to get closer to those stakeholders in your organization. This is good, but there's a lot more facilitation work to be done. And going back to that Uber Eats example, if we're preparing for those 3 major user journeys or flows, think about internally how that works. How many stakeholders you need to touch. There's marketing, city-focused initiatives, many more. As noted earlier, not only are the products we're designing getting more complex, but people are using them in more and more scenarios. Our solutions have to be flexible enough to account for really almost any context. It can feel a little bit like this when you've signed up to determine that path forward. And there is a path forward. As much as we like to think of design systems alone as this some kind of savior from the chaos, we're well served to first look a bit deeper and remember that humans relied on modular component systems to expedite production in different ways for decades now. Here's some examples. With the Model T assembly line in 1913, you can see these foundational themes, themes that are consistent characteristics found in high-performing teams today. The managers and engineers responsible for building the process, they focused on feedback and discussion to drive improvement. When we look at the famous Apple's human interface guidelines, we see statements of empathy like this one. People aren't trying to use computers, they're just trying to get their jobs done. In 2012, Twitter introduced Bootstrap and set us down a new path of what was possible. This original responsive framework made it relatively simple to get started with a set of design patterns paired with a component library that could handle pretty much most devices in the world. In 2015, Google was ready to get into the game and they released Material Design. I really love the statement that they made in the footer of this material site. It's, they're relating it all back to a purpose. Material streamlines collaboration between designers and developers and helps teams quickly build beautiful products. When we pull back to look beyond screen-based design systems, Lego is really a timeless example. It's designed as a system of play. At its roots, it's just really collections of stuff. Yet, here you can see many things built with this same collection of stuff by leveraging guidelines. Each has their own purpose and personality while maintaining that obvious connection to the same pattern family. And yes, you can even build really complex, beautiful stuff. But the problem is without direction, without a shared purpose or a shared commitment to process, communication, and constraints, you might end up with a familiar but divergent outcome. Stuff can get kind of weird. We've seen this, right? Some beautiful style guide gets completely misused. When constraints are up for interpretation, people will just inevitably misuse the stuff. So here's the big difference between collections of patterns and style guides. Design systems are really more than just the stuff that's inside them. If we borrow from a more standard definition of systems, we see that design systems are a collection of reusable elements guided by clear standards and structures, coherently organized to let us build better products faster. There's intention behind it. It's intended for an audience of users, so we can work together toward that shared purpose. Traditionally, we've seen things like this in a design system, some UI components, maybe some code, some content patterns. This captures the what, the stuff. But how do we capture the intention, the rules, the how? And how does that capture the shared purpose, the why? Having a shared purpose is the key to an effective system. It presents an emergent quality. It really moves us forward. We put so much energy into process and standards, but we really don't spend enough time talking about how we align around a common vision. How do we work together? And time after time, it's shown that this is really the fundamental differentiator for effective teams. Yes, of course, it's important to put the right stuff into your design system and use it the right way. But how do you determine right? Well, it's a combination of people, ownership, governance, purpose, and a shared vision. Purpose and people are really the two most critical pieces of stuff that you'll probably find in your design system. There's an interesting pattern we find in systems where that behavior of the system will ultimately adapt to the behavior of the organization that it comes from. This is reinforced by Conway's law. It says organizations which design systems are constrained to produce systems which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. Sort of like this quote, culture really isn't what you say, it's really what happens. So this can be sort of depressing, or it can be an opportunity. At this point, we probably just need to level set in here and make sure that, we're not thinking that somehow a design system is going to change your culture for you. It's not. But it can be the canary that exposes the cultural challenges, as well as the catalyst, the spark that will help you start to solve them. So let's start with the why. Effective design systems focus on their purpose and principles. Why are we including this stuff? Why are we using it this way? And how does it help us achieve where we really want to go? Principles are foundational. They help guide the system, as well as the products that we build with the system. There's this really good diagram from the book, How Buildings Learn. It shows the difference between things that are foundational versus things that change frequently. So the base of the house, right? The walls, these change rarely. Whereas the stuff on the inside, the paint, the furniture, these might change year over year. Over time, the foundation may be shaped by the things that change the inside, but that happens really slowly. More often, the stuff on the inside is shaped by the foundation, by the size of the house, the footprint, even the style. Let's take a look at this historical example of a Facebook card pattern. Here's a picture of a card from sometime in 2017. And you can see that there's shared principles and purposes across each element, even if each variation is slightly different. Without even knowing Facebook's design principles, we know what purpose a media element has. We know that because of the information architecture, because of the interaction, because of what changes versus what stays the same. So here's a card from 2013. It looks a little bit different, but it really contains the same elements. The design's changed, but it's clearly still a card from the same company. And we can still gather the same purpose each element has as we could from the first. That's what happens when you design with principles as foundations. So your principles are the foundation of your work. So how do we figure them out and then apply them? Many design teams will start with a word like simple to describe their principles. It's a good word. We certainly want to create simple and elegant solutions, but here's the problem with that approach. Context. What does simple really mean? And to whom? How would someone know when something is simple enough? Is simple the same for everyone? Is simple actionable enough to give me that guidance? And what do I compare it to? Or conversely, is it possible to make something too simple? When do I lose my brand voice? Is there a time to be complex or whimsical? And how do I apply this? Simple is really hard to interpret consistently. So it may not be a good guide to help your team make tough decisions. A good rule of thumb is that your design principles should feel out of place if applied to another product. I would guess that, most of all design systems aim to be simple and easy to use. That's just fundamental UX thinking. So, like what words and phrases describe how your team works? There's a story that comes to mind about a company that started to create their design system principles. They came up with the words easy and simple, but they quickly realized that those words can significantly change from meaning from person to person. So after some brainstorming, they ultimately came up with customer comfort. And for this company, that phrase was an authentic expression of how they wanted their users to feel while using their product. That's the crux of principles. There's 4 characteristics that will determine whether they're successful. Good principles reflect your values. They're clear enough to help you make decisions. they're time and context agnostic, and they're useful when they're only actually used. The last one's the kicker. People value what they see and what they use. Define them up front, make principles part of your routine, bring them up in design reviews, and use them as objective tiebreakers when people disagree. Now, as you're thinking about principles, think about who you're working with, because each of those groups is going to have a different view of what makes for a good system. As it turns out, that's a good thing. The agency Sparkbox has run a survey around design systems the last few years, and the results signify this. Of teams that say they've been successful creating a design system, about 77% said it was built and maintained by a cross-functional team, not just design. From the same teams noting success, about 79% said it was integrated into developer systems. So now let's look at the key factors that challenge the success of the design system. Adoption, maintenance, staffing, no executive champion, all of these are non-platform decisions. It's all about the people in the practice. In order to figure out the path forward, you have to identify your team and look to better understand them. Get to know your stakeholders and make them your allies. As designers, we have the skills. We're so used to empathizing with our external stakeholders, our customers, but our internal stakeholders and peers, not so much. So how do you sell the value internally? You can only start to do that by clearly identifying what matters to them. Start with why is this important to them, their team, and the overall business. There's just a few of the standard questions that you can begin to ask to know where you fit into your stakeholders' point of view. What's important to our partners and how they work? What's important to them about how they work? How are they measured? And what causes the most friction for them? When we talk to teams about collaboration in design systems, we put a lot of emphasis on creating a shared language across design and development. In the case of our stakeholders, I want to challenge you to also consider learning to speak their language. If you're a fan of college football, there's one quote that sticks out to me from one of the greatest coaches in the game. He talked in simple terms about the focus of winning your box, the area directly in your control. Now, he follows that with everybody wants to make plays. It's not about making the plays, it's about executing and following the process of what it takes to play well. That's how plays happen and trust is built on multiple levels. One way to facilitate this type of trust is to create an agreement to define the roles on your team. We found really good results leveraging the RACI model, and I just want to provide a quick overview before we jump into governance. So RACI is the practice of defining a team by the roles. The acronym stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. The trick here is really arriving at that shared understanding that empowers the responsible party to be the decision maker. Their job is to facilitate the process and solicit the perspective from those that are consulted. The benefit of the model that advances a shared understanding of the problem and the potential solutions. It's driven by an identified and empowered decision maker. The really interesting part here is when you go to apply it. Now, if I look at an example of, let's say, designing a component, the designer is the responsible party. The design manager is accountable for the designer facilitating the process with those consulted parties, which in this case are those cross-functional peers. Now, when you get to the point of actually building out the component, the responsible party switches and is now the engineer. So within the same process of designing and building the same thing, the RACI model can actually shift, which is where it starts to build those opportunities for trust. And actually understanding that everyone is going to have the opportunity to make an important decision and leverage their expertise on the process moving forward, but everyone can't be at the driving or at the steering wheel at the same time. So let's go a little bit deeper into governance. Sure, I was mentioning we have obviously a lot of good content on designbetter.co, and here's an example. If you haven't had a chance to look at our design systems handbook, I highly recommend it. It's a really good free resource. In chapter 2, it goes into a lot of these governance models that you might start to see out in the wild. So some of these models represent common governance patterns that we see to make sure everyone knows their role and control for complexity at scale. If you have read content around governance models, you might be familiar with some of these visuals that were designed by Nathan Curtis. So the first is a solitary model. This is where basically one person is managing the system for a group of people. They're the ones managing what goes in, what goes out, as well as the documentation. The main challenge here, of course, is that it doesn't scale well. That single person can really easily become overwhelmed. So the other model that we see a lot is the centralized model. Rather than just having one person managing the system from the outside, you generally have a team managing the system as a full-time role. This can work really well, for controlling standards and ensuring that you have a single place where things are getting updated and communicated out. The challenge is that it can distance designers from the customer's needs because they're not really working on customer-facing projects. One way to navigate this is to get them involved in user research, which we've seen a lot of success. The next model is things start to naturally evolve. We see more complex organizational systems start to surface around really how to make this design system thing work. This is what we call the federated model. And here, instead of having a single person or team managing the system, you have people spread out across the design organization who are contributing to and managing the system together. It's key that customer-facing designers contribute back to the system while not getting overwhelmed. So in this case, obviously it's with larger organizations, but we see design ops functions start to emerge. Now we come to the natural evolution of hybrid models. Within that handbook that I mentioned a minute ago, Gina, who led the design system at Salesforce, writes about how they adopted this hybrid type of model. Through experimentation, they figured out how to blend the benefits of the centralized and federated models to suit their organizational culture and resources. And it's going to be dependent, per organization, of course, it'll be different. So going through this process helps you determine the different groups to account for: the core, your partners, and external, your customers. So what activities need to happen for each of these groups? Then you start to think about who needs to get involved. Looking back at that RACI model, who's responsible for the decisions? Who's consulted? And who's informed? Sometimes it's nice to lean on a visual to drive the point home. This progression highlights the nature of communication complexity and the importance of having purposeful and consistent messaging. Remember, we're dealing with more educated stakeholders than ever. Each additional person exponentially cranks up the complexity of our communication and collaboration within the team and across the organization. So remember Conway's law: the system is a function of the organization, not the other way around. Self-organization is a critical step that many teams miss, but it's probably the most important step in ensuring the success of the system. It's important to bake your organizational culture into the process and also make it flexible. Revisit it. It's a bit of a two-step forward and one step back process at times. That's okay. Moving forward with purpose and being open to reflection is really critical. And of course, if you try to force it, the system or the culture will always kick back. So as we're thinking about what goes into the system, we want to account for people and purpose behind it. This is another area where where there's a lack of cultural strength behind a design system can really cause it to fall down. At its core, the design system contains foundational elements such as typography, brand elements that really set the voice and tone, then components or patterns APIs and tech specs, followed by documentation, your guidelines, principles, and language used to facilitate adoption. So how these pieces fit together to service your design teams and products really isn't set in stone. There's many similarities due to interaction design conventions. Design systems can really vary depending on who you talk to and how your team chooses to approach the problem. This is where a shared vocabulary comes into play, and assumptions really need to be challenged. So there's this really fun exercise that we run with teams to connect the dots on language and assumptions. It doesn't take a ton of time, and it's really quite useful outside of the context of design systems. It's identifying the process and how to make toast. So you might be thinking, this sounds a little strange. So take a moment and think through the steps it takes to make toast. It might seem pretty obvious to each one of us. You might think it's pretty standard process, but we've run this with many teams, and what's funny is it actually varies quite a bit from person to person. So here's some highlights from one of the sessions that we ran. Some people get pretty specific with their instructions, right? Like add butter before toast cools. I love that one. Other people get really simple. And what starts to surface is how people can think about approaching a problem in so many different ways. Some think about all the way back, how the grains are harvested and brought into the process. And then there's this one, which is an amazing way, in my opinion, to think about the process. And it just shows how completely different way of thinking of how to make toast. So what goes into making toast? A lot of things, right? But seriously, think about this. If there's just so many mental models for something so simple as making toast, think about the mental models for creating a design system to serve multiple teams and products. What does it take to make a component? What does it take to push it to production? We have to really expose these models, ensuring inclusive participation from all the groups and perspectives involved to model our system of governance effectively, if it's going to reflect reality and not kick back. It's very easy to have blind spots, which create misalignments and issues down the road. I love this quote from Henry Ford. It says, if there is any one secret of success, it lies in the ability to get the other person's point of view and see things from their angle as well as your own. And finally, start small, but plan for the future. How do you know that you're on the right path, right? We need to think about all these things: empathy, inclusion, collaboration. We need to treat the system like a product and have it on the same level of respect as the other products that we're designing for. How we talk about them, how we staff them, share them, they really all make a difference in their success. And ultimately, a successful design system makes the people at your organization successful. It's a service tool, right? And you're serving the folks inside your organization, your users. So treat your internal users the way you'd want to treat your users of your core products. Because these things are not going to build themselves. Collaboration and empathy are critical. So where do we go from here? This quote from Christopher Alexander brings many of these concepts together. When you build a thing, you cannot merely build that thing in isolation, but must also repair the world around it and within it, so that the larger world at that one place becomes more coherent and more whole. It's not just about the stuff, but it's about the people around it. Design systems require a new way of thinking. And when done well, it really frees up a lot of time to have more of an impact, to create together and to build better products and better culture. Design systems can invoke a new way of working better together. And finally, design systems are for people. They should balance, there should be a balance when you're investing in the people and the practice and the tooling when embarking on that journey. So thanks so much for having me today. With that, we'll kind of open it up to some discussion.
Thank you, Jay, for that presentation. I really love that example. That was really fun. Um, Quickly, I I've never designed a design system before, so um, my first question would be, should we think of design systems as a living and breathing thing that requires updates and improvements through time, or should it be something that fundamentally doesn't change much? And how do you observe what elements of the system require updating or rethinking?
It's a really good question. I think this is where a lot of teams struggle. Design systems are new, but we're kind of approaching them in a different way. A lot of teams want to build out this super amazing design system and then have this really big moment to reveal it. It often doesn't work, right? Like it is a living and breathing thing. It is a product, it's a service tool that's going to service the people within the organization, and there's a lot of change. So getting to a point where we can bring in the right stakeholders um, outside of design, right? The design system isn't just for designers, it's for developers as well. It's for any stakeholder that's trying to push a product out to market. And there's going to be change along the way. So getting the buy-in early, and deciding on like, what is that MVP of a design system where we can get people using it? When is it going to be valuable? When does it have, enough stuff in there where we can start using it? It's not going to be perfect. There's not going to be this big reveal moment when we launch it and everything is great. It's going to be a work in progress. And I think that's where, again, I've seen a lot of teams fail. They spend so much time trying to have this magnificent design system before they launch it. And then you end up just not getting value out of it. So getting it to a point where you can get people using it and getting value out of it initially is where you want to be. The second part, I think, was you're asking about contribution model a little bit and how to get people to kind of.
It was more, how do you observe when it requires updating or rethinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a living and breathing thing as well. Um, it varies on when things need to be updated, right? Like I think that kind of goes into the governance model. Like at what point, what does a version release look like? How many components do we want to push to I guess define a new version? It really comes down to the organization and the products that you're building for. Um, that's maybe not the best answer there, but that is kind of, it's really gonna depend from
Yeah,
organization to organization.
totally. I understand. There's no silver bullet, because it really depends on the context and how the organization is structured. I think just one more question from me. Us speaking from a freelancer's perspective, a lot of times, at least, projects on Braintrust, our workers are hired into a team as a sort of like a full-time hour contractor. So you're really hired on as a team member, not
Right.
as, an independent one-off freelancer. And so really you get integrated with other team members. As a designer, you also work with PMs and engineering, et cetera. However, you're still an outsider. If you do see design systems that should require change or updating, what's the best way to approach something like that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a design system for that purpose is highly valuable because it does, it's not just a sticker sheet and component library. It really gets into the documentation and how things should be used. It talks about, again, going back to the principles and the foundations, um, setting that voice and tone of the components and when they should be used and when they should not be used. So it's a really good tool for getting teams up to speed very quickly and understanding, the organization and kind of how they all fit in. We've seen, varying degrees of contribution models. And again, I think like it's an evolution. We often see very small teams standing up a design system that start maybe even as the solitary model and moving into more of the complex, federated governance models. Oftentimes it's a hybrid though, because again, it does come back to that organizational level to kind of dictate what's going to work. But you know, having a section in the design system for a contribution model. So if you see things that need to be updated, it could just be as simple as, you know, email any suggestions here into the team and we'll review that. Or you devote time at the beginning of a sprint or in a design review or a weekly stand-up, where you devote time to talking about some of the changes or updates to the model, and just getting everyone involved. So, you know, I think one of the biggest pieces here that we kind of talk about, like when, you know, we have a product DSM, obviously for design systems, again, it's the success isn't really tied to the tooling. It's really about how the teams are built to stand up a design system, what sort of process they have in place. The tooling is such a small piece of it, but having the opportunity to have people contribute back to it, and be very dedicated or have that very defined is very important.
Yeah. Crystal, Claire, do you have any questions or thoughts for Jay?
I thought the slide you showed with the different structural organizations reflecting, or the culture of an organization reflecting in the design system. I thought that one slide you showed was just so interesting. I wanted to keep looking at it for a really long time, but it kind of went by a little fast. I wouldn't mind revisiting that subject.
Yeah. So this is the complexity, like let me just go to the. Need to figure out now how I get back to Zoom. Give me 1 second.
You just click on the share again.
Crystal, were you talking about, because I had a similar one with the, when we go from 3 to 4, this one, or was it the company organization led by like different orgs?
I found them both really interesting, but this one I found really easy to understand just at a glance. The other one, I was just like fascinated. I just couldn't gather it all in the amount of time that was allotted. It was going a little fast for me at that.
This is a great slide. I wanted to see this also because I missed who said it. I want to steal this for future presentations. So thank you very much, Jay, for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is in Keynote, so I can make sure you all get a copy of this as well, or PDF it, whatever's easier. What was the other slide, Crystal, that you were mentioning? Was it the different governance models?
Sorry, it was the one where you were talking about how the culture of the organization affects the design system. And there were a lot of little diagrams with a lot of little lines. For example, Facebook is structured like this, and Google is structured like this. I think it was towards the beginning. It wasn't
okay.
any of these. It was
Trying to remember now which one it was.
I don't know, if you send us the PDF or the, you know,
Yeah.
then I can just look at it. Yeah, I think maybe it was this one. That was
One-way law, that's right.
Yeah. I thought everything you said around there was so interesting, but I definitely would like to give it another glance.
I'll make sure you get a copy of this. Yeah, I think, you know, InVision it was a design tool, right? That's kind of the inception. It was a prototyping tool. We worked with a lot of design teams. Design teams are leading the charge when it comes to design systems, but they do fail if developers are not involved or other stakeholders are not involved. And I think that's a really big piece as well. Like I said, I work with some of our largest customers. A lot of them happen to be in financial institution kind of world where things move very slowly. There's a lot of red tape and politics involved. And when we can't bring, you know, other stakeholders to the table and it just kind of gets stuck with design, they fail, right? Like developers have to be involved, product has to be involved. And then outside of that, we really just have to tie this back to business value, because ultimately it's not just about designing beautiful things, but it's about, you know, the user experience and the actual ROI on the design and being able to save time and create efficiencies within this whole process and keeping things consistent. And it really does matter, but again, tying that back to business is very important. And again, another plug for designbetter.co. We have some books in that area as well. Business Thinking for Designers is one of them.
Are there a few links, Jay, that I can follow up with you on that you think folks should check out? Like just as a next step, okay, we
Yeah,
have a presentation, you talked about a handbook, definitely betterdesign.co, but just want to give people something that's pretty anecdotal that they can take.
absolutely. Yeah, designbetter.co is a really good resource. So it is sort of our thought leadership arm of InVision. We release books, we have talks, all kinds of stuff. So I'll just shoot you a link in the chat. And the one handbook that I referenced is here, the Design System Handbook is here. We just released another one called Design Engineering Handbook. But the one that I just read recently, which I found super valuable, is the Business Thinking for Designers. And again, it ties back to why is design important and how we can kind of get design a seat at the table when we're talking about business. So really, really good, easy to read. And there's a audiobook version as well, I think for most of these or all of them.
So when you say the design engineering, is it still, who is the person who starts the initiative? Would it be the UX director or?
Oftentimes it's UX or design ops function. It really depends on, like I'm working with larger organizations, so they typically have a design ops team or function, but it typically does come from design. It comes from pain points, right? Like designers are designing comps and they're pulling components that are all over the place. They're not updated. They don't know where to go. There's no documentation. Again, they may have a shared sticker sheet across the organization, but lots of inconsistencies and a lot of work just kind of digging for the latest version. And so that it kind of stems from the tooling piece. But again, the tooling is such a small component here. It's really about organization, the governance model piece, the contribution model piece, and then connecting that all to code, right? Like if developers are having to rebuild the same button over and over and over, there's a lot of inefficiencies there. And that kind of ties back to the business value piece, right? Like when you have a 1-to-7 ratio, design to development ratio, there's a lot of developers that are wasting a lot of time rebuilding stuff over and over. Where if we can have things documented, things easier to find, we have up-to-date components and designs that are connected to code, we can start to have a really big ROI here.
Very cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
Any other questions? I actually didn't see the chat. I think there's a couple of comments, but I don't know if there were questions.
people are praising you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I think we will send this back to the folks that are not able to join us today, and I'll follow up with the links that you had provided us. And we really appreciate your time.
Yeah, well, great to be here. Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, Jay. Have a good
Take
week.
care. You too. Bye.